And today we're going to be doing a reaction video, but it is not the normal reaction video. Today I'm going to be reacting to every single U.S. president's funeral. Yes, with the recent passing of President Carter last month, his funeral was just yesterday. If you're watching this video on the day it comes out. So we're going to go through every president in American history, going back to George Washington all the way to Jimmy Carter in chronological order of their deaths, and reacting to the funerals. Now, obviously, there's not video for all the funerals, but for the older ones, I'm just going to be taking a look at a picture and just kind of examining, who's there, where it's at, what's going on, things like that. I'm going to be reacting to it. I don't know most of these. I've never seen pictures of a lot of these, so it's going to be a blind reaction. So we'll see what happens. Jumping right into George Washington. This is on the Mount Vernon website. I found this picture. Wikimedia Commons. So this is George Washington's funeral from December of 1799. He was the first president to die. He's the only president to die in the 18th century. He died on December 14th, 1799, just 2 weeks before 1800. So let's see if we can magnify this a little bit. Kind of examine, see what's going on. Well, it's telling me to wait. I guess we're just going to zoom in like this. Here we go. So this is Mount Vernon. If you've never been there, that's George Washington's estate. The whole state funeral idea has only been a thing for about 15 presidents. Back in the old days, it was hard to travel and things like that, so they didn't really have big state funerals in Washington, D.C. Plus, Washington, D.C. was not even finished yet by the time of Washington's death. He only died 2 years after he left office in 1797, and he's the only president to never live in Washington, D.C. He was inaugurated in New York City, and then they moved the capital to Philadelphia toward the later half of his presidency. But he was the only one to never live in Washington, D.C., yet he's the one who the city's named after. But anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. So this is at Mount Vernon, which is his estate. There's them putting his tomb inside of the vault, whatever this chamber is here, this mausoleum-looking thing. I've been there, got a picture in front of that. What's interesting is there's a bunch of trees over here. I don't remember that being there, the real Mount Vernon. There's actually some other people buried around this area. I assume this is probably his wife Martha, who's still alive at the time. And one thing that Washington did is he released all of his slaves in his will upon the death of his wife. I think his wife died in 1802, just 3 years later. Not sure who this guy is or any of these people, to be honest. I know John Adams was in attendance. I looked that up. So, John Adams was president at the time when Washington died. So this is George Washington's funeral from 1799. Unfortunately, I could not find Thomas Jefferson's funeral procession. I couldn't find any portrayals of it anywhere. If any of you guys in the comment section know anything about, who was there or anything like that, but we know the date of it, but we don't know, there's no pictures of it. So I really tried to look. I just could not find anything. But what I can tell you is he died on July 4th of 1826, which was the exact 50th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson was the second president to die. He was the third president in total, but he was the second president to die. He's buried in Monticello in a family cemetery in the back. Likely the reason for there being no portraits, he probably had a small private funeral with not too many guests on his property, so that's probably one of the main reasons. But yeah, he is buried on the property in a gravestone. This is his house at Monticello near Charlottesville, Virginia. I have been there. It's freaking beautiful. So yeah, he's buried there. No funeral picture, though. Unfortunately, I was not able to find a funeral picture for John Adams, who was the third president to die. He died just about 5 hours after Thomas Jefferson. And among John Adams' last words, a lot of people like to point at, were Thomas Jefferson survives. But Adams was actually wrong. Jefferson had actually died about 5 hours before Adams did. What's the biggest coincidence is two of the most big name founding fathers, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, who both wrote the Declaration of Independence, helped authorize it, both died on the 50th anniversary on the exact same day. That is just crazy. But this is the building that John Adams is buried in Quincy, Massachusetts, the United First Parish Church. He is buried in this vault along with his wife, Abigail Adams, and also his son, John Quincy Adams, who later became president. We'll see if we can find a picture of that one. But yeah, he died in 1826. He was 90 years old. He was born way back in 1735, so he was the second president. At the time of his death, his son, John Quincy Adams, was serving as sitting president when John Adams died, so that's kind of neat. And here's the vault. You can go inside. I've actually never been there before. I'd like to. It's up in Massachusetts. That's where John Adams is from. So yeah, pretty cool. Unfortunately, I couldn't find any pictures of the funeral procession just because of how early on in history it was in the 1820s. So it's kind of hard. If any of you guys know anything about Jefferson or Adams' funeral that you'd like to throw down in the comments, that'd be very appreciated. Shout outs to Alamy for sponsoring this picture. I don't own the rights to any of these pictures, just so you guys know. I'm just kind of showing you just for the sake of this. But here is James Monroe, who was the next president to die. He died also on the 4th of July in 1831, but his funeral was a little bit later. He was originally buried at a different location that he is now. He was buried in New York City, where he died in 1831. It wasn't until 1858 that they moved his body to Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond, Virginia, where it is today, in the famous bird cage grave, which is an amazing site. I've been there down in Richmond a couple years ago. But this is the New York Marble Cemetery where he was originally buried. As you can see, there's buildings in the background. I can't make out really who any of these people are. The president at the time was Andrew Jackson. So he was serving at the time of James Monroe's death. But he did have a pretty large service, James Monroe. He had the military there and everything like that. So pretty cool for him. As you can see right here, he had a bunch of soldiers marched around when they were doing the final words service before the burial. So Monroe had a really big crowd compared to the others so far. So unfortunately, just like Adams and Jefferson, a lot of the founding fathers we don't have much record of for their funerals, for portrayals. James Madison was the next president to die. He was the fourth president, died in 1836, and he was buried on the property just like Jefferson. He was buried at his estate in Montpelier, Virginia. His estate, he was buried, so likely had a smaller turnout with little known record, but this is his grave site down there in Virginia. I've been there as well, screamed his name for Smash, as we always do, so go check out that video. And yeah, what I did find interesting was the eulogy that was given at Madison's funeral was actually written by and addressed by John Quincy Adams, who was former president at the time. Jackson was president when Madison died, but John Quincy Adams actually gave Madison's eulogy, which was pretty interesting that I found. The next president, so the next president to die, we jumped quite ahead in the order, was William Henry Harrison in 1841, who was the first president to die in office and also the shortest serving president in history. He was only in the White House for 31 days, because as the story goes, he caught a bad case of pneumonia after giving the longest inaugural address in history in the rain, and he refused to wear a coat, and he rode in on his horse, because he was an old general from the War of 1812, the hero of Tippecanoe. So he comes in and dies 31 days in. Now, Harrison is the very first president to have a nationwide state funeral. As you can see, we got the Marine Marching Band here, or what was to become that eventually. This funeral took place about 3 days after he died, before they shipped his body back to North Bend, Ohio, which he's buried today. But this is the old executive mansion. At the time, this is very early on in history. Washington, D.C. looks completely different than what it is today. You used to be able to just walk right up to the White House, or it was called the Executive Mansion at the time. But yeah, Harrison is the very first president to have a state funeral. There it is. He was the first president to die in office up to that point, which makes sense. So, there's William Henry Harrison. Here is Andrew Jackson's funeral from 1845. He was the next president to die, president number 7. This is the grand funeral procession in memory of General Jackson on June 24th of 1845. It was held in New York City, at the time being the biggest city in the country. So this was more level of a state funeral, because Jackson was a nationwide hero and known for being more of a general rather than president. He was considered the first president of the common man, but a lot of people refer to him as General Jackson as opposed to president. So he died in 1845. He was buried on the property at his estate called the Hermitage down near Nashville, Tennessee. But he had a state funeral in New York, and looks like there were a lot of people in attendance. So he's in here, and we got some horses. Very cool. Bunch of people. Looks like they had the military doing parades and all that good stuff. So that's Andrew Jackson's funeral. Quincy Adams, unfortunately, just like his father, John Adams, I could not find a funeral picture for. He died in 1848. He was the next president to die. He's buried, he was originally interred at the Hancock Cemetery, just like his father, when he died, which is right outside of the First Parish Church where they're buried today. They eventually moved his body into the church in the 1850s, so just a couple years later. But this is his original crypt at the Hancock Cemetery in Quincy, Massachusetts. Fortunately for James Polk as well, passed away in 1849. I could not find a funeral picture. However, I do have, this is probably the best I can do. He's buried right here on the grounds of the state capitol in Tennessee, and this is the state capitol building at the time when he died. Much smaller than what it is today, and there was trees everywhere, but there is his grave. I have been there. Pretty cool where he's buried, but I just could not find a picture of the funeral procession. But this is where James Polk is interred. He only died about 3 months after he left office. He was beaten and sick, and he only served one term. So the next president to die was Zachary Taylor in 1850. He was the second president to die in office. And this is his state funeral in New York City. They did all the state funerals in New York. Grand funeral of General Zachary Taylor, old rough and ready. So he only served about a year before he died. So as he died in office, there was a big funeral for him. He was buried in Louisville, Kentucky at National Cemetery. What are you doing? Which I've also been to. So he had a big crowd there, as seen. Kind of similar to Andrew Jackson's, they had it in New York because he was a major general during the Mexican-American War. So pretty cool. It was in January of 1862, so he went about 12 years without a president dying. John Tyler, which I could not find a picture of his funeral either, but I have a really good reason for that. He died in 1862 in Virginia, and he was elected to the Confederate Congress, but actually didn't get to serve. He died before he could take a seat. So John Tyler is the only president in American history for his death to not be recognized by the U.S. government. In fact, he died a citizen of the Confederacy, so a lot of people see him today as a traitor. But this is his grave in Richmond, Virginia. Fun fact, this giant tomb over here, I mentioned James Monroe's body was moved to Richmond when in the 1850s, about 27 years after Monroe was originally buried in New York. That is James Monroe's tomb. This is an area of the cemetery called President's Circle. And so they have John Tyler's grave right here and James Monroe's right over there. So you can literally see James Monroe's and John Tyler's right next to each other, probably about 20, 30, 50 feet away. It's really close, but John Tyler's death was not recognized by the United States, which is hence probably why we don't have a picture of his funeral. This one's really weird. I found this picture. This is Martin Van Buren. Martin Van Buren died just a couple months after John Tyler, and this is a photo from his funeral. I think this might just be a weird... Actually, I don't even think this is his funeral. I don't even know what that is. Van Buren's funeral either. I don't know why they didn't portray these old funerals, but he died in 1862. That one I just had was actually like a political cartoon thing. That wasn't actually real. They were just slandering Andrew Jackson and Van Buren. But this is the cemetery in Kinderhook, New York, where he is interred today. And yeah, no funeral picture of Van Buren. Okay, this is one that's certainly going to have a lot of coverage. So this is 1865. Abraham Lincoln was the next president to die. He was assassinated, the very first president to be assassinated. Third to die in office. This is his funeral. So there are a lot of Civil War era soldiers. The Civil War, the surrender at Appomattox was on April 9th of 1865. Lincoln died on April 15th. Just a couple days. He was shot on the 14th. He was shot 5 days after the end of the Civil War. But as you can see here, this is a lot of people. And I think Theodore Roosevelt, there's a story that he recalls from his childhood where he actually remembers, and he was in attendance of Lincoln's funeral or a parade of some sort revolving his death. And he actually remembered that Roosevelt at the time was probably about 7 years old. So kind of interesting. But this is Lincoln's funeral, giant state funeral for his assassination, obviously led the country through the Civil War, one of the darkest hours in history for the U.S. But this is his funeral. It's Abraham Lincoln. Unfortunately, just like a lot of presidents from this era, the next president to die was James Buchanan in 1868. I could not find a picture of his funeral. This is a photo of his grave from 1908, so about 40 years after he died. But he's buried in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Another very frowned upon president that a lot of people probably don't care about looking into his funeral. But there it is in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. That is where he's buried. The only president buried in Pennsylvania. 15th president. Here is so the next president to die was his predecessor, Franklin Pierce, who, as you probably guessed, does not have a picture of his funeral procession. He died in 1869, just a year after Buchanan. So he's buried in New Hampshire. Here's his grave. I've not been there. However, a lot of his kids over here died young that are also buried with him. And yeah, so Franklin Pierce, no picture of his funeral, sadly. Andrew Johnson, who died in 1875, just a year after the last one, the year after Fillmore. This is the National Historic Site where he's buried in Greenfield, Tennessee. Can't really make out any faces, but that's pretty cool. Now we're starting to get to the time where photography is starting to get more relevant. So here's the state funeral for President James A. Garfield, who died in office in 1881. He had been shot months before his death. He was shot about 2 months before he actually died. A very slow death for Garfield, but he had a huge statewide funeral. He was the second president to be assassinated and the fourth to die in office. So here's some pictures from 1881 when he died. So you can see a lot of people in attendance. There's the casket going up into what looks like the Capitol. Here's another one of Garfield. So this is him looking at his casket. Here's Chester Arthur, who's vice president at the time. He's going to take over after Garfield when he passes away. And there was a lot of controversy amongst the stalwarts and half-breed Republicans for Chester Arthur's legitimacy. Some people thought he was born in Canada, and that they were kind of just used that as not wanting him to get in. But there's Chester Arthur, so that's kind of neat. So here is the parade leading up to Ulysses S. Grant's funeral. A lot of people in attendance. Grant, at the time of his death in 1885, was probably the biggest celebrity in the country. He led the Union to victory during the Civil War. That's what he was famous for. He's buried in Manhattan, which was the most populous site in the country, and probably, you could argue, still is today. A lot of people. Huge parades on the streets. He's buried in a beautiful grand tomb there. Highly recommend checking it out someday if you're ever in New York. Here's some portraits from Chester Arthur's funeral. He died in 1886. So pretty interesting. I don't know what all these palm trees are, but you can see them carrying the casket, ceremony, all that good stuff. So there he is. There. That looks like, if I'm not mistaken, the president at the time, Grover Cleveland. That looks a lot like Grover Cleveland. That is Grover Cleveland. He was president at the time during his first term when Chester Arthur died, so he was there present at the funeral. So that's pretty cool. You can see him there. So now we're starting to make out some faces. The state funeral for Rutherford B. Hayes in 1893. As you can see, we got some marching bands. We got military on horseback. Old Civil War style. He was an old Civil War general. B. Hayes was a major general, actually, in the U.S. Civil War. So here's him in Washington D.C. for his funeral. He was buried in Fremont, Ohio, where he was from, but this was his state funeral in 1893. So here's from Indiana. They actually held a funeral at the Indiana State Capitol in 1901 when he died. And William McKinley, president at the time, was also in attendance. And people claim that McKinley is the very first sitting president, to attend a funeral of a former president, which is kind of weird because I'm pretty sure, and I also checked, that Grover Cleveland was at Chester Arthur's funeral, so I don't really understand that. But whatever. Here we have McKinley's funeral. McKinley's is the first one that I found that's actually on video. So this is from 1901. Like I said, he died in office, so we're going to react to this here.
Library of Congress in
I don't own the rights to any of these videos.
Washington, D.C.
This is a little bit. Let's see. It's the Library of Congress. So here's the video from McKinley's funeral, 1901. Just going to kind of skip through it. Obviously, there's no audio. All film was silent back then. I can't really make out anybody. It looks like we have a parade going on. So this is in Buffalo. So pretty crazy. I think this is just the parade. But this is a video from the parade. That's really cool. Some old war generals. McKinley did serve in the Civil War. He was the last president to serve in the Civil War. Obviously, he was assassinated, like I said. Huge crowd there. So, pretty dang epic. Actually, is this Buffalo? This could be Canton. He was buried in Canton, which is his hometown. Not sure where this is. Does it say? They did 3 different ceremonies. There was one in Buffalo when he died. There was a parade. There was one in Washington, D.C., and then also in where am I blanking? Canton, where he's buried. Pretty cool here. This is just highlights from the parade here. Okay, let's see if we can find the hearse. Unless that was it. Oh yeah, that was it. So here they go. They're taking his body up. There's McKinley's picture right there. Isn't that something? Now, phonographs existed, but it was hard to merge sound and video in the same thing. So this is just a silent film. That's really cool. All right. This is the only picture I could find from Grover Cleveland. Grover Cleveland was the next president to die. Unfortunately, because there wasn't as much coverage for it, McKinley got assassinated. So there was a lot of coverage for that funeral, and it made international headlines. But Grover Cleveland did not get that kind of love, unfortunately. He was buried in Princeton, where he was from, and this was the parade of his funeral. A lot of people there, just no video of it that has survived, at least not that I could find. He died in 1908, so this is his funeral. Big parade and everything, just not on video. So here's the funeral for Theodore Roosevelt. So now we're into the 20th century, so we're pretty deep into film now. So camera has really taken full swing by this point. So from here on out, we should have video of all the funerals. I'm hoping. So this is in Oyster Bay, 1919, where he died. So this is some photo, again, still silent, from Theodore Roosevelt. So the man himself. After the services at Christ Episcopal Church. George E. Talmadge precedes the casket. So there's a casket, so Theodore Roosevelt's in there. It was January. There's a lot of snow outside. I actually just did the freaking Snow Angel challenge earlier, so that was very cold. But Major General Leonard Wood was one of Colonel Roosevelt's most intimate friends. He was in attendance. Oscar Strauss, former progressive candidate, governor of New York. Pretty cool. That's it. Another one that's certainly going to have a lot of coverage. This is Warren Harding. Died in 1923. He died in office. He had a heart attack in San Francisco on a trip that he late into his term. He died at the age of 57. Buried in Marion, Ohio. But I'm sure this could be a state funeral. Looks like it's got the parade. Also silent. I don't think sound was put into film until about the late 20s, late 1920s. This is 23. A lot of people, this also made international headlines. Harding was one of the most famous people alive at that time, and it's kind of ironic because no one really knows about him today. He's one of the most forgettable presidents for a lot of people. Kind of frowned upon for a lot of his scandals and things like that, but what? What? Hold on. That is Harding. How is he speaking at his own funeral? Hold on. What? Flashback. Here's Woodrow Wilson. So Woodrow Wilson was in attendance. Makes sense. He was still alive. President. At the time when Calvin Coolidge had just been sworn in. There's Coolidge. So he was sitting president, just took office. He was vice president under Harding. So this looks like a state funeral in D.C. Pretty cool. Here is Woodrow Wilson. He was the next president to die just a couple months later in February of 1924. Dr. Woodrow Wilson, yes, he's the only PhD as of now. So very cool. He is actually the only president buried within Washington, D.C. He's buried in the National Cathedral, which is actually where they just held Jimmy Carter's state funeral. Pretty interesting. Champion of the League of Nations. We got any audio with this? No, we do not. So here is his house. He lived in D.C. This is where he died. Originally born in the South and then lived in New Jersey for a little bit. He was the president of Princeton. But his house was right there in Washington, D.C., not too far from the cathedral. So they're probably going to take his body to the cathedral. Yep, there's the cathedral. Just finished just a couple decades prior, probably less than 20 years. I think it was finished in like 1907. So it was only there for about less than 20 years at that point. Brand spanking new cathedral. Parade. Here's them taking the casket out. When he was in attendance at the time. Coolidge was president at that time, and William Henry Taft was on the Supreme Court as Chief Justice. I'm sure there were a lot of prominent politicians in attendance there at the time due to it being in Washington, D.C. Commander-in-Chief Wilson. This is kind of a TV showing of it. That's really cool. It's over 100 years old. There's Cathedral. Woodrow Wilson. Rest in peace. Veterans of the Bethlehem Chapel, the Washington Cathedral, Westminster Abbey. Something. The Westminster Abbey of America. It's a nickname for it. That makes sense. Cool. I'm trying to make out any faces. I can't at the moment. Yeah, so birthplace, Staunton, Virginia, president of Princeton, governor of New Jersey, president. So pretty cool. All right, so here's some stock footage from Taft's funeral. Okay, we actually have, so he died in 1930. We got a little bit of sound with this one. So Washington, D.C., he was buried in Arlington. There's the capital. 1930, so about 95 years ago. Maybe there isn't sound. So it's Taft. So Taft was Chief Justice after he was president. He left office of presidency in 1913, and then Warren Harding appointed him as Chief Justice in 1921, which he retired from just before his death. Now, Arlington is not actually in Washington, D.C., it is in Virginia. So Wilson is still the only president to actually be buried in D.C. But Taft is pretty close, and so is John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy is also in Arlington. Rainy day, looking like in March. Next up, 1933. Who was Chief Justice in 1933? When was Charles Evans Hughes Chief Justice? So here's Calvin Coolidge's funeral from 19. It's an awful lot like Charles Evans Hughes right there, who was Chief Justice at the time. Pretty sure that's him. It looks a lot like him. I was actually looking for him in Taft's, but I couldn't find him, but I think that's him there. Coolidge died in 1933 in January. A lot of people there. He's buried in Vermont, but let's see who these people are. That looks like Herbert Hoover right there, if I'm not mistaken. Hoover would have been president at the time. That looks an awful lot like him. So it looks like Evans Hughes and also Hoover are in attendance there. Not too many ex-presidents alive at that point at all. I can't think of who. I think Hoover might have been the only president alive up to that point. I don't think there were any former presidents left after Coolidge died then. At that very moment. But Hoover's going to leave office in like 2 months, though. Oh, yeah, so that's in Vermont when he was actually buried. Okay, so now it's 1945. During the end of World War II, we have Franklin Roosevelt. This one has been colorized, actually, with audio. So let's try to listen to a little bit of this.
Here are the great, and here, too, are the many like you and I. He was the leader for us all. An official delegation headed by President Harry S. Truman is here. The train has just pulled in, and the special honorary guard, the bearers representing two non-commissioned officers from
obviously Roosevelt died in office.
each
So
of the
big
services,
turnout.
Army, Navy, Coast Guard, and Marine
Worldwide
Corps,
headlines.
have lifted
Due to
the
this
late
being
President
during World War
Roosevelt
II.
from the train and onto a solemn, sorrowful procession through in that long, slow trip. Senators White and Ellender. We're going to try to walk out nearer the caissons and therefore nearer the Army Air Forces band. Perhaps you can hear some of the music that they're playing. Quite a ways in the distance, crowds are lining Constitution Avenue from here.
We don't need to watch all this, but here we go. There's some people in the car. Let's see if we can make out anything. Military. Did it fly over?
Last time, execute that do not allow the case towards the entrance to the White House and the detention. In the background, directly in front of the White House door, is red on his computers.
pretty far ahead again, but this is John F. Kennedy. He was actually the next president to die in 1963, so we didn't lose any presidents for a while until actually was the next one to die, so that's kind of crazy. So now we're in so he's actually Catholic, so he's got a bishop here doing the ceremony for Kennedy. So he was obviously assassinated in 1963. So Arlington. The story goes, Kennedy was visiting Arlington a couple of weeks before his death, and he told somebody sitting next to him that he could spend the rest of his life here because it was so beautiful. And they buried him there. I don't know how true that is, but kind of interesting. That was a state funeral. Okay, now this is 1964, Herbert Hoover's funeral. Now, most people living in 1960 would not have guessed that Herbert Hoover would outlive Kennedy, but he did. So.
Along the sweep of Pennsylvania Avenue, where Herbert Clark Hoover had driven in his hours of greatest triumph and bitterest defeat, his body is borne to the Capitol to lie in honored state. It is the third time in less than a year that America has watched the coffin of a fallen leader make the slow ascent of these steps. The President and Mrs. Johnson lead the dignitaries who come here to pay their final respects to the 31st President of the United States. Previous services had been held in New York, where Mr. Hoover died at 90. Others are to follow at his Iowa birthplace. After the leaders depart, the rotunda is to be open to everyone, which is as it should be. For though in the 30s he was widely blamed for a depression he could not have averted, in later years Mr. Hoover was even more widely recognized as one of the great humanitarians of our times. To a grassy knoll in West Branch, Iowa, overlooking the house where he was born, Mr. Hoover's cortege moves through some 75,000 mourners. It is a sunny autumn day for his homecoming.
Kind of like Jimmy Carter in a way, did a lot after his presidency.
Simple rites reflect the Quaker faith of the farm boy who was to become the first president born west of the Mississippi River.
1969, we have Dwight D. Eisenhower. His funeral procession.
Love my children.
There's a cathedral.
Last words of a president, commander of the Allied forces which reclaimed Europe from the Nazis, president of the United States. He knew how to win. Inevitably, that last battle had to be lost. And so they mourned for him in Washington, as they did throughout Ike. Early past loved their most famous soldier. The empty saddle would forever remain empty.
His most famous World War II, it didn't matter who he was running against, he was going to win. It didn't matter if George Washington was back from the dead, Eisenhower was going to win that election.
To the humblest, Ike will always be remembered.
I like Ike. Good man.
Inside the massive rotunda of the Capitol, his widow, his family, and the representatives of many nations waited for the simple flag-draped coffin to be borne into the Hall of the Great, to rest there in state while the thousands who loved and admired the man with the always ready smile came to pay their last tribute. Coffin until the following day. Full-grown who bear his name with pride, not alone in his... The Shah of Persia, sad-faced and sorrowing, not alone in his feelings. The Shah of Persia, sad-faced and sorrowing, not alone in his feelings. Feelings shared by all the high and the mighty assembled at this deeply emotional time. The silence behind Nazi scourge. Waited for them to the remains. For 2,000 distinguished mourners united. President de Gaulle. King Bedouin. Wartime comrade in arms, Lord Mountbatten.
The former President Lyndon Johnson.
Lyndon Johnson, there he is.
President Nixon, his wife and daughter.
There is Nixon.
And the general's widow and family, those for whom grief was so personal. Here from Washington.
It's really bad quality for some reason. This is Harry Truman's 1972. He was less of a public figure than the other guys, probably opting for a more smaller funeral than the big state ones like his predecessors had. So he died in 1972. His wife, she was alive up into the 80s. I think she died in 1980. 80-something. She was like in her 90s. She's the oldest lived first lady. She was like 97. She even beat Rosalynn Carter.
Funeral service was Lyndon.
It was a funeral in 1973. Lyndon Johnson. So he died just less than a month after Truman. So that was the longest time in history that the U.S. flag had staffed, because it's on half staff for, I believe, a month, 30 days or so after the president's death. And so Johnson died before it was back up from Truman's death. So that was the longest it had ever been half staffed.
This is footage of his funeral services in the Capitol Rotunda from January 1973. It's a half hour.
January 22nd, 1973. Yeah, Texas. There's Nixon right there. He was president at the time. I believe the only living former president up to this point. Now. He's not even former. I don't think there were any former presidents now. Commentary. Oh, this is 30 minutes. Holy crap. Former Secretary of State Dean Rusk. He gave a speech or something. Check that out.
Your importance.
This was 1994. We have Richard Nixon funeral. Like I said, he was the president at the time of the last 3 deaths, and he was the next one to die, but about 20 years later. So this is in California, in Yorba Linda, where he's buried. That's the house he was born in, so really cool. Let's see who's on attendance here. So he's from the other side of the country, born in California. I've been there. It's beautiful. Good place to have a wedding, too. Somebody was getting married when I was there, so that's kind of an interesting fact.
Rise for the plane of honors.
So there's Bill Clinton. He was sitting president at the time.
Please rise for the plane of honors.
And then there's, looks like George Bush.
Is placed on the chancel.
Right there. Go to the chief. There's Bonnie Nixon. Obviously, Nixon did end up resigning the presidency in 1974. Only president to do so. Let's see what we got here. His wife was dead by that point, Pat Nixon. She died a year before him. It's like Kissinger. I don't know. I'm just guessing. He just looks like his glasses. If so, he just died in 2023, which is insane. see what we got here. So it looks like we got a lot of former presidents. We got Reagan, Carter, and Ford all there. That's cool. So Clinton is the only one still alive of these. Jimmy Carter just had his funeral. This guy. So this is Nixon. So all the former presidents are in attendance. That's really cool. They're actually in chronological order too, with all the first ladies. So we got Hillary Clinton, we got Barbara Bush, we got Nancy Reagan, Rosalind Carter, and Betty Ford over there as well. That's pretty cool. That's a cool little shot right there for Nixon.
Of Richard Milhouse Nixon, the 37th President of the United States. Today, this
see if any of the former presidents gave eulogies. I'm curious to see, because they do that a lot. See if Bill Clinton said anything. It's an hour long. Here's
so expected.
Just trying to see here.
They couldn't get along with each other often, but they couldn't get. Eulogies will be delivered. The first of the eulogies will be delivered by former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger.
And here's Kissinger.
They had such a mixed relationship. They couldn't get along.
So Kissinger, he's about 100 years old, 99 or 100. He just died in 2023.
Along with each other often, but they
reacted.
So he's giving eulogy. Who else we got speaking?
A husband and father who said that the best memorial to his wife was her children.
Damn! Just like Eisenhower.
Rich and working hard. Tens of millions.
The butter.
Places that boy.
Foreign Policy Advisory Group was Richard Nixon.
The second half of the 20th century. On a farmhouse without water.
It's got to be Eisenhower's son. There's no way it's not. That's crazy. Who's this guy?
Anyone who ever saw him together.
Sure. See if any of the former presidents got. Okay, so Clinton did speak. So now more the traditional. It was highly televised.
Beside the same tiny home, mail ordered from back east, near this towering oak tree, which back then was a mere seedling. Put it in the past. A great citizen.
This guy.
I once was lost.
Now they're putting it in.
I don't know.
And I'm sure there were others at the other funerals as well. We just hadn't showed up because now we're starting to get really modern.
Might wind through.
Okay, so now we're on to 2004, the next president to die. 10 years later is Ronald Reagan. So here is his state funeral. He's also buried in California. There's Nancy, First Lady.
President Clinton and others will be surprised to see her looking at Margaret Thatcher. People are quite surprised to see her standing as she is. Her doctors had not let her do much travel lately, but she is there and has a very long day ahead because she will be accompanying Mrs. Reagan back to California. Christiane has and the former president, Gerald Ford. We actually just saw President Clinton and the former president exchange some very warm greetings. They put hands on each other's shoulders. Talk a little bit.
So too. This is a picture that our viewers are now seeing on television. He was.
He often seems to be.
Ronnie himself certainly believed that he had been given
we got Margaret Thatcher
back his life.
For their return to Washington. President Reagan's visit had been important.
Bush.
The nation did. Who can forget the horrible day in March 1981? He looked at the doctors in the emergency room and said, "I hope you're all Republicans."
Sitting president.
And a cheerful confidence that life would bring good things.
It's all important, President.
The qualities all of us have seen in Ronald Reagan were first spotted 70 and 80 years ago. As the lifeguard...
He was 93. He was really old, Reagan.
Came over the whole land veil.
Bishop of D.C.
That was established, and then as you all have...
Our presidents, you saw...
All right, so next up is 2007. We got Gerald Ford. He actually died when I was in the womb. So I was born a couple of months, about 2 months after this funeral. Here's Gerald Ford.
Body of our brother Gerald for burial, that he will raise with them.
Man, he's looking old there. That was like 18 years ago. There's Clinton. I'm sure all the former presidents are in attendance. Bush was still president at this time, W. Bush. See, Reagan there, she was still alive up in 2016. There's George W. Bush. Now you start to see your traditional ceremony. Oh, George Bush said some words.
Do it. Wouldn't be prudent. Now, in the end, we are all God's children, and on.
But then he came from a generation.
Did George W. say anything?
And fellowship in the
So he's buried in Grand Rapids, Michigan.
A sheep of thine own fold.
H.W. Bush, this is 2018. We're jumping ahead. See if we got the audio. So this is a really long, this is 4 hours, so we're just gonna kind of jump around, see what it will be. So also in the cathedral. This is the most recent death before the current. Really good camera quality. Well, all right, so here we go. We got Donald Trump sitting president. You got Clinton, Carter, Obama. Is George W. there? Oh, he's probably. Oh, there's Biden over here, vice president. What else we got back here? Biden wasn't president yet, but he was there. That's interesting. There's Michelle Obama. That makes sense.
In New Hampshire once.
Resolute.
A critical ingredient called revenue.
The bathroom in our small duplex.
George W. Eulogy.
He was a tolerant man. After all, he was kind and neighborly to the women with whom he, Mom, and I shared a bathroom in our small duplex.
That's really cool. It's kind of so honorable having a son who was also president. speak at his funeral. State funeral.
In Washington, D.C., our nation's
Bringing back
capital.
the body to Texas. Now we got Jimmy Carter's 2025. Died in 2024. So I just watched this earlier. So there's Bill Clinton. We got George W. Bush. It's the same type of format. Now we've solidified the cathedral being the main place. Kamala Harris is here, Vice President. Mike Pence back here. Some other familiar faces as far as former presidents go. We got Trump and Obama. They're all there. Although I don't see Michelle Obama for some reason, but we got George W. Bush. So these are all the presidents that are alive today, former presidents. Biden should be in there too. I think he shows up later. Where's Biden? So current president for a couple more days if you're watching this when it comes out. So I thought this was really cool what they did for some of the eulogies. You're in.
Father's faith.
Supported
my mom and gave her.
So they had Gerald Ford's son give the eulogy that Ford wrote before his death, which Ford died before I was even born. So that's kind of insane. I thought that was really cool. And then we also have Walter Mondale's son.
We have Jimmy and
looks just like Mondale. If you told me that was Mondale, I'd believe you. That was his vice president, Carter's vice president.
Was this close?
This guy's well.
What? The
I
hospital.
think he got his son.
About and told him
grandson, that is. Talking about
to
how
understand that
he
everyone
was a normal man, guy that common
should be treated with dignity,
out.
deserves and even shot.
Here's the
Not a
president's
guarantee,
address.
but just a shot.
Biden.
A hard-working farmer who.
It was always a place.
Is your Archbishop? Obviously, is a Catholic place, the cathedral. However, it is used for the state funerals and heads of state, things like that, because it's called the Westminster Abbey of America. So this is Jimmy Pictures. There's Biden. I'm not seeing the end of this yet, but so now they're moving the body out. Take it down to Plains, Georgia. This was yesterday. So now they're probably going to bury him probably today or whatever. Down there in his home with his wife. He's exiting. Is going to conclude the funerals of every single president, except for maybe like the first few, because we only have pictures and then some of them we didn't actually have. But if you find any pictures of those online from the old presidents, let me know. That was a long video. Obviously, the rest of the presidents are still alive, so this video will be outdated at some point. But for now, that's every president from Washington all the way to Jimmy Carter's deaths and their funerals. So hopefully you learned something. I definitely did. It was fun watching some of the old ones. So let me know what you guys think. I'll see you guys next time. Be sure to comment, like, subscribe. Goodbye. Wow.